Well, Frian said, this wasn't at all what I expected. Since Corlin Harbor had something like a temple university, she expected the public school to have similarities to the temple schools that educated the lucky few villagers that were blessed, or cursed, as Jerkniv would say, with them. Indeed, even the Imperial Magic Academy and the Empire's universities took inspiration from the educational institutions of the slain theocracy, albeit the Imperial product was thoroughly scrubbed clean of any religious influence and further altered to suit the Empire's needs. They stood at the entrance to one of the classrooms, much as they once had during their visit to the Imperial Magic Academy. Rather than classrooms filled with the best and brightest young minds that the Sorceress Kingdom had to offer, however, the classrooms in Corlin Harbor were filled with adults. The subjects being covered wouldn't place them in the highest echelons of the bureaucracy, they were simply learning how to read, write, and perform basic arithmetic. Apologies for being somewhat underwhelming, Clara said. I sense a healthy dose of sarcasm in your words, dear Countess, Frian replied. Needless to say, it was the exact opposite of underwhelming. She was beginning to think that the word impossible was not something that the Sorceress Kingdom applied to itself. When it came to what the Merchant Guild considered professionally viable literacy, the average rate across Riestais and Baharuth was somewhere under 10%. A tenth of that number was what the Imperial administration considered the bare minimum for employment in its civil service, and the vast majority of those who met that standard were members of the Empire's aristocratic establishment. As stringent as the Empire was, however, it never seriously considered educating the general public to raise the ratio of qualified citizens. One was either suitable or they weren't, and education was considered a private affair in the Empire. Its resource requirements aside, education was as potent a weapon as one could arm oneself with in civil society, so it was jealously guarded. The temples, guilds, and the Empire itself saw fit to regulate both its availability and content. It wasn't out of the realm of expectation for unwanted scholars and rogue artisans to be driven out of towns and cities, have their property and possessions burned, or just outright get assassinated. To what extent do you plan on educating your citizens? Frian asked after they withdrew from the door to walk down the hallway. For the time being, Clara answered, achieving what the guilds consider suitable for a professional career, with the eventual goal of every citizen in possession of a basic universal education. I can tell you with near certainty that the reaction of the Imperial Court Council to your stated objective would be preposterous, Frian said. Matters of cost aside, where do you find the staff to instruct so many pupils? What practical end does doing this serve when that level of education is unnecessary for the daily lives of most? That assessment is understandable, as it reflects the practical realities of the region. At the same time, this realism is possibly the greatest obstacle in understanding what the advent of the Sorceress Kingdom brings. I can't call it stubbornness. Yes, you can, Lian said. But it's a sort of inflexibility that I often see plague mediocre merchants. Changes and trends wash over the markets, but they cling to their holdfasts as if weathering a storm. This same problem can become orders of magnitude worse when dealing with well-established noble houses, as they are tied to their land and that land has become a constant for them. This sort of conservatism does often win out over temporary fluctuations in one's situation, but the Sorceress Kingdom is not a temporary existence. In their attempt to anchor themselves against what they imagine to be a rough current, those who resort to familiar methods will drown themselves in a flood. Frian understood what they were saying, but, if she were to use the same analogy, the Baharuth Empire was the one used to being the flood. Few understood and fewer still accepted the Emperor's sudden and unprecedented capitulation over a year previous, and he wasn't in any way inclined to make himself look weak attempting to explain his position. Not that it would inform them of what Frian had witnessed thus far. Then how would you explain what you're doing here to the court council? Frian asked, or any noble of the Empire, for that matter? To them, the sheer logistics that must be involved with your efforts would be dismissed as the folly of an ignorant and naive girl. Everything flies in the face of what they know. It doesn't take a genius to grasp how my methods are accomplished, Clara answered. Once again, the problem is that certain connections aren't made due to both preconceptions of practicality and attitudes toward the Sorceress Kingdom. Yeah, that trip to the Empire was a huge disappointment, Lian said. Somehow, Ludmilla of all people managed to get them to visit when all of our faffing around in our winter barely got us anywhere. I thought our presentation would have everyone banging on the gates to get in on the deal. House Gushman thought they might be able to employ what you offered in its silver mines, Freyan noted. Yeah, then they ditched you at the border, Leanne said sourly. Don't tell me they dumped all of their stuff on you. They did, in fact. She had come not only to visit her friends, but also to see what could be done with her new title. Now, she had all of House Gushman's business to take care of at the same time. Since the Empire is more familiar with what magic could do for a country, Clara said, we thought that what we had to offer and its ramifications on Imperial society would be self-evident. Don't tell me that was the reason why. I'm fairly certain that it wasn't, Freyan replied. I believe the Empire's reputation abroad combined with what most visitors see in our winter has painted an exaggerated picture of magical integration in our country. The percentage of wizards in the population is still minuscule and most of them go to the Imperial Army or work in the Imperial Ministry of Magic. What about all of the graduates from the Imperial Magic Academy? It pains me to say this, Freyan said, but those who don't graduate from the magic stream to enter service as professional mages quickly forget what they've learned in class. I have a colleague in her 30s and she can't recall anything at all from her academy curriculum. I'm of the mind that the entire court council is in a similar situation. My cousin doesn't even bother trying to think about it, he just turns to me whenever there's some magic-related thing he wants explained. Her 3 friends from the Sorceress Kingdom frowned at her response. She did her best to mask her embarrassment. Most of the time, people made excuses about forgetting about one thing or the other until they got old enough to use a variety of age-related excuses instead. Freyan was reasonably certain that they were excuses for their lack of diligence. Her grandmother was 4 times her age and she remembered everything. That academy education sure seems useful, Leanne said. What about the scions who go on to lead their houses? Ludmilla asked. If you're asking about territorial development, Freyan answered, the best way to put it would be that they go with what's popular. There are some bits and pieces that have embedded themselves in our common knowledge, such as contracting the Army Corps of Engineers to lay down infrastructure or perform flood control. I wouldn't expect them to remember the intricacies of the magical side of things, however. Ordering magical lighting or building levees amount to little more than numbers on a page. I suppose that's one of the things that drove you to write that treatise. Freyan nodded. Most people knew as much about blacksmithing or sailing as they did magic, so it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Still, she wanted more for the Empire as a society, and so she doggedly pushed for the spread of magical knowledge and the slow process of reform that it made possible. Then, if we go back to your original question, Clara said. Does the Empire employ golems in any fashion or at least know of their industrial implementation? I have some knowledge on the subject, Freyan replied, but golems aren't used in Imperial industry. For the most part, they're valued for their military applications. I see. In that case, one of the first challenges that we must address in light of our changing reality is the concept of the spare. With the plentiful supply of food and other necessities, increased effectiveness in health care, better security against deadly threats, and obsolescence of the levy, the Sorceress Kingdom is facing an impending population explosion. An average rural household in the region has 5 children and rural households make up 95% of the human population. Thus, the number of humans in the Sorceress Kingdom will more than double with each generation. The conventional use for spares in the region is menial labor in towns and cities. They are also employed seasonally in the country if there is a need for them. In the Sorceress Kingdom, menial labor is a role fulfilled by the undead, and they do so far more cheaply and quickly than humans. As a result, not only will spares find that they don't have work, but the entire web of industries that exists to service them will cease to be. Within the next 4 years, the full implementation of undead as menial labor will be in place. Spares will not be able to survive as they do elsewhere. We are in a race against the future, and we are currently losing. Worse yet is the fact that, out of all of the territories in the Sorceress Kingdom, Calling County is by far the furthest ahead. Except for Ludmilla's place, Leanne said. But she's a cheater. In that case, Freyan said, why not employ contraceptives to control population growth? That may be an option for some, Clara said, but we are short of temple staff for the task. It will take decades before we have the capacity to see to the needs of the entire population. Freyan pondered Clara's words. Most saw the Sorceress Kingdom as not a functioning country, but as the lair of the Sorcerer King. The first thing that came to mind was Einzulgan and his endless legions of undead, and the idea that the country had a population at all was only represented in the idea that countless people were suffering under his rule. So, rather than a luxury, Frian said, you consider education a necessity. That's right, Clara replied. The classes you've seen so far are students being educated so they can be educated. The conventional methods used by the guild system cannot hope to keep up when apprenticeships take 6 to 8 years to complete and the population doubles every year. Director Alpha proposed that we switch to a system that is admittedly more impersonal, but far better suited to dealing with large numbers of people. For that system to work properly, literacy is a must. But how will they gain practical experience? Frian asked. They'll have to take turns, for now, Clara answered. They went to her ground floor, where Clara led them deeper into the school grounds. She opened one of the doors of a warehouse-like building to reveal a large workshop where rows of men and women toiled away at their stations. A few men walked up and down the rows, occasionally stopping to observe one of the students or address some aspect of their work. Much like the Imperial Magic Academy, Clara spoke of the Ring of Hammers. The day is divided into periods. Students are rotated between classes for basic education, theoretical vocational training, and practical work similar to what an apprentice at their level does. Do you recoup your costs with this work? I wish, Lian snorted. You are more likely to get a bent nail than a straight one out of these guys. I didn't even know that was possible. Frian wasn't sure how nails were made, so she couldn't say how difficult it was to produce straight ones. The results are mixed, at best, Clara said, but they will get better. Director Alpha told us that students should advance by grades each lasting a year, and those grades should be standardized according to the average student's rate of learning, but it's far more difficult than it sounds. How so? Frian asked. Classes in the Imperial Magic Academy are identical in that aspect. It's easy to advance students who learn quickly, Clara said, but what do you do with students who are slower than average? Apprenticeships have a range for that reason. Those students fail and are expelled, Frian replied. Which is a terrible waste, Clara told her. The only reason the Empire can do that is because education is not something it truly invests in. Aside from the rare scholarship which is meant to secure talented individuals for the Empire, the Imperial Magic Academy is run as a business and its customers pay for their terms in full and in advance. They have no obligation to see students succeed. Furthermore, students must qualify for admission, which requires a personal or family investment in that education. After all that, the Imperial Magic Academy can simply fail them. Compare that to an apprenticeship under the guild system. A master is both invested and obliged to see the apprentice succeed because the apprentice is paying for their education through labor in the workshop. It is illegal to expel an apprentice without suitable justification, so the student is practically guaranteed an officially recognized education in their trade so long as they are earnest about their studies. Once they fulfill the terms of their indenture, they are free to pursue their own careers. By comparison, an imperial scholarship indentures the student for life. In certain ways, it is better to be a slave in the Empire than it is to be a scholarship student in the Imperial Magic Academy. It's pretty clear which system is designed to be mutually beneficial and which system is made to exploit the population for the benefit of its master, Ludmilla said. Do you mean to say that this new system of education favors the ways of the guilds? Most of her peers in the Imperial administration would say that the Imperial Magic Academy's system stood at the forefront of education in the region. The guild system was considered an antiquated and inefficient, but necessary evil. Of course, every official in the administration was a graduate of the academy. It's a compromise for both practical reasons and the sake of experimentation, Clara admitted. I prefer the guild system, but, as I mentioned, it's impossible to implement in its conventional state. Director Alpha insists that the system of mass education she proposed is supreme whatever that means. With what few instructors she has in training, however, it cannot be implemented to its full extent. Then who are the instructors here? They are from the guilds, Clara said. They were understandably horrified upon being shown the unmodified system of mass education proposed by Director Alpha and insisted on having their members instruct classes in this school. At the same time, artisans tend to dislike teaching apprentices how to read and write, so they were more than happy to concede that portion to Director Alpha's methods. I suppose that rather than a scholastic academy like the one you attended, the institution here is a school that advances its students into their respective trades. But can so many students find work? Freyan asked. Oh, most definitely. The Sorceress Kingdom's economy is almost entirely fueled by its primary industries. We produce far more resources than we can process, as do most of our allies. Out of curiosity, Freyan said. Since this institution uses something similar to the guild system, does that mean its graduates are free to pursue their new careers wherever they please? They are, Clara said. Profit is not everything, after all. They'll need to comply with the regulations of wherever they choose to move, of course. But aren't you worried about losing your investment in those people? If I understand it correctly, they are the recipients of a fully subsidized education. They are, initially, Clara said. But the goal is for our students to graduate as grandmasters in their craft according to guild standards. They'll have long paid off their debt by that time and will already be earning an income through their production during their master years. Clara's statements took a sharp turn into ludicrous territory again. Grandmaster artisans were both rare and renowned. It was to the point that the rich and powerful would travel to other countries to commission their talents. Yet, Clara implied that she would mass-produce them with her new school. Assuming that it's even possible, Freyan asked, wouldn't you be averse to losing a Grandmaster artisan? Not in the sense that you are implying, Clara said. Even if they move to another country, they still aid in our cause. If enough of them do, the Sorceress Kingdom will become renowned for producing Grandmaster artisans. Every graduate who puts their roots down abroad is a seed planted that will help counter the unfounded rumors about our country. Was it bold ingenuity or heedless optimism? The Empire would be loath to let anyone of talent go as it meant strengthening other countries at the expense of itself. The realities of the Sorceress Kingdom, however, were as Clara stated. The loss of a handful of Grandmaster artisans, or even hundreds of them, still couldn't strengthen a country to the point that it could effectively resist the Sorceress Kingdom. Since the Sorceress Kingdom refrained from rampant violent conquest, it actually put itself at a disadvantage due to its image as a country ruled by the undead and all other manner of dark creatures. Yet, Clara chose to face that battle head-on. After observing several other workshops of different vocations, Clara led them back out into the town's eastern plaza. I know you said that you didn't want to be treated as an invalid, she said, but I don't want to push you too hard. Let's retire to the castle for a late meal, shall we? Of course, Freyan nodded. I'm not feeling strained at all, but you're probably right. What you've shown us so far gives us much to discuss. Freyan idly watched their surroundings as they strolled along. The plaza was still quite busy despite the late hour. She idly wondered how many of them were students or their families. Do you plan on expanding this new system of schooling to other parts of your domain? She asked. Once we get through a semester or two and work out the most glaring issues, Clara answered. We should have complete coverage by the end of next year. Complete coverage? Freyan frowned. That's including the rural regions? Absolutely, Clara said. I can show you a map of how everything is laid out after dinner. It wasn't terribly difficult to figure out. She says that. Ludmilla's voice came from the other side of Clara, but she's been planning this out for a long time. She was already starting to build all of the necessary infrastructure less than 2 months after the annexation of Irantal. Every village in the county is an hour or less away from the nearest town by Solita, Clara said, so it was simply a matter of making sure that the roads and facilities were ready in each town. Clara thinks that most people somehow master plan everything over breakfast, Ludmilla said, and then she has people and resources moving all over the place the moment she finishes her meal. Even people from other countries aren't safe from her. They left the plaza, walking up the ramp leading to the pedestrian route overlooking the highway. Freyan placed a hand on the railing as they made their way to the castle, gazing down at the massive harbor that was the town's namesake. Magical lighting illuminated a row of dry docks where a handful of barges were being assembled. Those barges are huge, Dimir said. Even the Death Knights look tiny beside them. They don't look like they're made out of wood. They are made out of steel, Leanne told her. Huh? But... Dimir adjusted her glasses, looking back and forth in confusion. How do you people have so much steel? She asked. Just one of those barges should take enough metal to fully armor an entire Imperial army group. It's enchanted steel, Leanne added. Frian gaped silently at the claim. There was little reason for Lian to lie, especially since they would have plenty of time to thoroughly investigate everything they were shown over the next week or so. "Where do these ships sail to?" she asked. "Throughout the Katsa River basin and out into the Cerulean Way," Clara answered. "Most of this port's trade is with the Draconic Kingdom, but we plan on steadily expanding our network of routes. For now, we're focusing on helping with their economic recovery." Oh. Dimia turned around with a little hop. "I heard about that." The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in an uproar when the news was delivered. "How did the Empire react?" "It didn't," Frian said. "The court council was convinced it was some sort of scheme, so the news was never released to the general public." Clara turned to look at her with a furrow on her brow. "A scheme? Why would they think that?" "Word of the Sorcerer King's death in the Holy Kingdom arrived a few weeks before," Frian replied. "Half of the court council suspected it was a test to see how we would handle major events. The other half suspected it was a test to see if we would undermine the previous ploy with the new information." "What did the Emperor say?" "He only snorted and said that Queen Auriculus was better off eaten." "Why would he say that?" Ludmilla frowned. "He greatly dislikes her for various reasons. How much freight would you say goes back and forth between the Corlin Harbor and the Draconic Kingdom?" "I'm not familiar with what's going on down there." Lian pointed over the railing to one of the barges sitting under the harbor's gantry cranes. "Each of those boxes can carry up to 20 tons of freight. One barge can ferry a dozen. That's about as much as a small galleon can hold, but, as you can see, we load and unload ridiculously fast. A round trip between here and the Draconic Kingdom takes anywhere between 2 and 3 days depending on where it's going. It's mostly grain these days." "That's fast," Frian said. "How do you manage sailing upwind that quickly? Is it part of the enchantment on those barges?" "Nah," Lian said. "We just use undead to propel them. These ships don't rely on the wind at all." "And how many vessels make this journey to the Draconic Kingdom?" 3 dozen, Lian said. "It'll be 4 come autumn." Alarm rose within Frian as the last piece fell into place. The Sorceress Kingdom was perceived as a clear and present danger in a military sense by every country in the region. What no one understood, however, was that they would soon be an economic one, as well. They would feed their exponentially expanding manufacturing base with their cheap and plentiful resources. Combined with the near-zero cost of their undead logistics, they would rapidly dominate any country that kept its borders open through trade. Lian grinned irreverently at her silence. For all of their tentative talk of experimentation and new frontiers, there was no way they didn't know what they were doing. Wilhelm was more right than he knew. The Empire has been overtaken in the blink of an eye. By the time the citizens notice it happening, it will be far too late to react. "So," Clara smiled, "how do you think we should approach the visiting nobles?" Frian smiled back despite herself. Everything they had seen and discussed was probably for the express purpose of wrangling her into their schemes. They appeared to be benevolent schemes, but they were still schemes nonetheless. "That," Frian replied, "is a discussion that can wait until dinner." 13th day, Upper Fire Month, 1 CE. "I don't see anything different. The entire border is like this," esteemed brother, Rangobart said. "Didn't your vaunted information network mention as much?" Rangobart's brother didn't dignify his sarcasm with a reply, but Rangobart was certain it was the case. About a year and a half had passed since the Battle of Katsa Plains, and the Empire's spies, dispatched by its merchants, aristocratic factions, and the imperial government, had long infiltrated the Sorcerer's Kingdom. There were even spies from the temples if he hadn't misheard. Depending on who they went to, however, the intelligence reports differed somewhat. Imperial patrols went on as usual, keeping an eye out for tribal raids and monstrous threats from the frontier. Imperial intelligence did what it could with its meager numbers, and the gist of its reports, at least as far as the army was aware, was that major threats abounded in the Sorceress Kingdom, but there wasn't anything that they hadn't seen already. The temples, being the temples, looked into the same thing. The undead that concerned them were the same military threats that Imperial intelligence was sent to take a look at, so, when the temples sent an endless stream of petitions to the court council upon learning what was across the border, the Imperial administration found the information that the temples shared with them matched what their own spies reported. However, As the temples implored the Empire to end its immoral association with the Kingdom of Darkness next door, they framed things in such dire terms that one might think that they were talking about something else. Indeed, the temples told everyone they could. The Second Army Group was informed just in case the Empire hid the truth from them. Decrying the Sorceress Kingdom as the blackest evil the world has ever known was a daily message delivered at every cathedral, parish, and temple school. At a certain point, Rangobart grew so concerned about the temple's activism that he asked a Death Cavalier what they thought about their public awareness campaign. It gave the matter some thought, replied that it was flattering, and said that it would be nice if everyone feared them just as much. Rangobart could only be thankful that the temples never considered interacting with the Death Series servitors. In hindsight, the forced integration of the undead with the Second Army Group served as a preemptive counter to the temple's activities on top of everything else. The priests could warn the people of the evils of the undead as much as they wanted, but those very same undead were seen by the citizens every day participating in security patrols. The tactic only went so far, however, as faith and reason weren't always in alignment. A crack in the pavement nearly bounced Rangobart out of his seat. Aranda let out a worried sound and his bodyguards tensed. Beyond the carriage window, the ubiquitous imperial landscape of crops, pastures, and copses continued uninterrupted. Just what were you expecting, esteemed brother? Oh, black clouds, carrion birds, fields of bodies impaled on spikes. It is a kingdom of darkness, after all. We haven't crossed into that kingdom of darkness yet, Rangobart told Arlander. Just what have your spies been telling you? There are several significant areas of concern, Arlander replied. Such as? The most recent thing that's come to our attention is a program of forced relocations. The poor people are being ousted from land that they've lived on for generations. Is it something like what happened shortly after the annexation of Iranthal? With the paupers' quarter being razed to the ground and its inhabitants relocated onto abandoned farmland along the imperial frontier? It was the first reported injustice that came from the Sorceress Kingdom, and those in power saw it as a ploy to populate the border and make it seem like nothing was amiss. When he had asked Baroness Saradnik about it, she confirmed that the quarter had indeed been leveled and repurposed into a demi-human quarter. That information didn't sit well with the Empire at all, and the temples only used it as further evidence of the atrocities carried out by the Sorcerer King and his legions of darkness. No, this is something entirely new, Arlander said. They are uprooting tenants from their land in the name of reorganization. The poor people have little choice but to comply, else they'd have their souls enslaved for eternity by the undead. It sounds like the temples have filled your head with nonsense. Nonsense? The temples are the foremost experts on the undead. You people have been squeezing Miss Gran for information for the last 2 weeks, Rangobart noted. Does anything about your interactions with her suggest that the Sorceress Kingdom is a land rife with injustice and suffering? She's obviously a minion of some sort, Arlander replied. Picking out the truth behind her words was admittedly a challenge, but I believe I have the right of things. Rangobart turned his attention back to the window. There was little point in arguing when they were so close to the border. They would soon see what was going on for themselves. A few minutes later, the carriage bounced again and went silent. He frowned at the strange sensation that filled the cabin. We've crossed over into the Sorceress Kingdom, he said. How do you know that? His brother looked out of the window. Nothing's changed. Look down, esteemed brother. Arlander glanced at the cabin floor, then half rose to look out of the window. The reason for the silence was not because they had stopped, but because the road they were traveling on had changed. What sorcery is this? It's dwarven stonework, Rangobart said. The mountain dwarves fixed up their old road coming down to East Estate and it looks just like this. Preposterous, Arlander sniffed. The Empire is supposed to have the best infrastructure in the world. This was a part of Riastais just last year, wasn't it? That damned bloody Emperor has squandered so much of our tax revenues on the Imperial Army and all of that magical nonsense that we've fallen behind. What a travesty. He could imagine the same discussion happening in every one of the delegation's carriages. For better or worse, nobles were proud of their land and competitive when it came to matters of prestige. Rangobart would have felt the same way had he still considered himself an agent of House Roberbad, but, now that he was the lord of an undeveloped wilderness of questionable naming, pretending to compete would be an embarrassingly laughable effort. An hour later, A large walled town near one of the old towers bracketing the highway appeared on the horizon. He couldn't recall there being a town on the maps that he had last seen of the area. Rangobart examined its blocky architecture as they turned off the highway and slowed to a stop. In a word, the fortifications looked very solid. Everything was cut from dark grey granite in the same seamless fashion as the pavement of the highway. It was as if someone had somehow fashioned everything out of a single piece of perfect stone at a scale that wouldn't be out of place for a major city. The parapets crested at over 10 meters and every tower was half again that height. Here and there, he could see the heads and shoulders of a death knight as it made its rounds atop the wall. "You'd think they're preparing to attack the Empire," Arlander said. "I'm reasonably certain that the Sorcerer's Kingdom doesn't require a forward base to launch assaults against the Empire with, esteemed brother. Then why would anyone go through so much effort and expenditure to build this? Why didn't you ask once we arrive at our destination? I'm sure our hosts will be more than happy to provide an answer." "Our hosts, huh?" Arlander murmured. "That part just makes it even more confusing. They're noble women, right? Bereaved widows and daughters who were supposed to be marrying into other houses. Why would someone like that build something like this? Wouldn't it be more appropriate for her to create a garden? Or perhaps the Sorcerer's Kingdom mandates the construction of these joyless-looking facades." The carriage darkened as they entered the town gate, which fed into a cavernous tunnel over 30 meters in length. It was a bit concerning that a town in the unfathomably powerful Sorcerer's Kingdom would need walls so thick. When daylight returned, they were greeted by another strange sight. "It looks like she created a garden, after all," Rangobart said. "A walled garden. Is the entire town a solarium?" Arlander breathed. Rangobart twisted his neck to look up at the sky. As his brother implied, the town had a ceiling fashioned from panes of glass. The streets were paved in the same manner as the highway, but, unlike most towns that only had the occasional tree in a courtyard and weeds struggling to grow on their beaten roads, care had been taken to ensure that there was greenery wherever one looked. "Where did she get all of the iron?" Rangobart eyed the delicate framework supporting the glass. "You could probably arm the entire Imperial army twice over with this." "It stinks of a trap," Arlander said. "A trap?" Rangobart frowned. "Oh, don't feign ignorance, dear brother. It all fits in nicely with the Emperor's plans. He's blatantly colluding with the Sorcerer King, trying to tempt the nobility into feeding the growing Imperial war machine. What better way to facilitate things than to have us use our lands to build up industries for their purposes?" "I can't say that I agree with you on that point," Rangobart replied, "but even if it's true, would it be such a bad thing? The Empire only stands to gain." Arlander snorted. "Oh, yes. The Empire. Perhaps we should be thankful that the Imperial Army hasn't brainwashed you to the point where you can't even remember your own name. Do you have anything meaningful to say, esteemed brother?" "We are the Empire, Rangobart," Arlander told him. "The Empire is composed of the people and those who represent their livelihoods and interests. Without us, there is no Empire. The Empire you refer to is simply a faceless creature that exploits us all to suit its self-serving appetites. Many improvements to the situation of the people have come to the Empire in our generation," Rangobart noted. "The removal of incompetent nobles, for instance." "Oh, grow up," Arlander rolled his eyes. "It's very clear what was actually going on. Undesirables were being targeted, as determined by the dictator's objectives. Half of those who were purged weren't anywhere remotely incompetent, they were merely obstacles to the absolute rule that the bloody emperor wished to enjoy. The incompetent only remain fresh in the people's memories because they are maintained as exhibits for one and all to see. At the same time, the imperial propaganda machine rewrites the transgressions of the past into virtuous deeds for the ignorant masses to adore. We are here to seek advantages in our endless battle against the tyranny of the imperial throne, Rangobart. Against the soulless bureaucracy that grows with every passing year. I would like to think that the former would be the first thing on your mind, especially since you have a completely undeveloped parcel of land to manage now." "You're not wrong." Rangobart purposely left his response on an uncertain note. His brother looked away, satisfied that he had scored a point against him. As a newly landed noble, the territory that he had been granted was an ever-present concern. He wanted to explore his options, but the thing was that House Raborbad and its allies were well-established houses of the interior and were out of touch with the realities of frontier development. His new seneschal, A recently graduated scion from a minor house, was similarly ill-prepared for the task. The Imperial Magic Academy, much like the Empire itself, looked to success for its examples. This had the unfortunate side effect of ignoring failure and many of the challenges that led to it. Everyone could be successful if only they worked hard enough, and failures were victims of their own incompetence, or so they liked to claim. As a result, consulting with the other Imperial Knights who had gone through the same experiences that he would in the future was the obvious choice. However, Rangobart didn't consider his family's stance on Imperial propaganda without merit. Only the truly ignorant could do so, so he would also be seeking the opinions of those outside of the Empire. Conveniently, he had an acquaintance in the Sorceress Kingdom who was also managing a mostly undeveloped fief. I wonder what sort of inn we'll be staying at. I can't recall any reservations being mar. Arlanda's voice trailed off as they passed the town's central plaza. Mixed into the crowd were the members of several demi-human races, a few of which Rangobart had never seen before. Is that an ogre? The corner of Arlanda's eyelid twitched. How dreadful. I suppose that the citizens are being forced to suffer its presence. It took Rangobart a moment to find the ogre in question. The towering demi-human was standing by a cart filled with faggots. Their carriage went by too quickly to see how the pedestrian traffic reacted to it, but it wasn't as if it had suddenly appeared the moment they passed. I'm not an expert on ogres, Rangobart said, but I'm pretty sure that one was selling firewood. Preposterous. How much of the poor human population have they replaced with these creatures? The townsfolk must be quaking in their boots. As far as he could tell, the townsfolk weren't doing anything particularly noteworthy. It wasn't much different from any other town in that respect. If anything would set them quaking in their boots, Rangobart said, it would be the undead. Quiet, you. I'm trying my best to ignore them. Rangobart obliged his brother and turned his attention back to the town. People weren't being butchered in the streets or impaled on spikes, but the fact that Arlanda's fears had proven to be unfounded didn't seem to change his attitude about the undead. If anything, the Sorceress Kingdom had become worse in his eyes because it was populated by the undead and demi-humans. The carriage took a turn shortly after leaving the plaza, bringing them to what appeared to be a warehouse district. Arlanda's bodyguards fingered their weapons as they rolled into a wide lot between the buildings. Rangobart's brother eyed their wary reactions nervously. What are we doing here? He asked. This doesn't look like an area that would have any accommodations. I don't believe we are staying in this town. Rangobart's gaze was drawn to the window to his right, where a line of carriages was parked parallel to their route. At least they looked like carriages. Each was far larger than any he had seen before. They rocked slightly in their seats as the footman disembarked from the back of their carriage. One came to open the door, and Arlanda silently willed Rangobart to get off first. Rangobart eyed the two workers with a slight sense of annoyance. What are you two even being paid for? In a dark corner of his mind, he quietly wished that he would catch them doing something illegal on a patrol in the future. Then, he realized that was probably impossible with his transfer to the 6th Army Group. Rangobart laced up his boots and stepped out onto the pavement. Unsurprisingly, he was the first noble out. Footmen were spread out all along the line of his party's carriages, looking somewhat lost with the occupants not emerging from their respective doors. Rangobart scanned the surroundings and, upon finding nothing threatening, he turned back to address Arlanda. I'm not dead yet, esteemed brother. Are you sure nothing is wrong? What does it smell like? He took an obligatory deep breath, then realized something. It doesn't smell like a town. What do you mean by that? Did they put something poisonous into the air? Is that why we've been brought to this vacant lot? I meant that it doesn't have the odors you would expect from a town. There's no scent of horses or horse manure. There wasn't any refuse lying around in the streets and no pools of standing water. He never thought that one of his first personal observations of the Sorceress Kingdom would be about its lack of a smell. If anything, he figured it would be just a bit undeadish. Despite receiving Rangobart's report, Arlanda still refused to leave the cabin. As the awkward impasse between the two lines of carriages stretched on, he busied himself by trying to make sense of their situation. The vehicles across from theirs had windows, but they were shuttered so he couldn't tell who was aboard them. Externally, they were detailed in a tastefully ornate fashion that would appeal to aristocrats and wealthy private citizens alike. The only odd thing about them was their size, as they were roughly 4 times larger than the carriages that had conveyed Count Rebobad's party and its entourage to the Sorcerer's Kingdom. As for the town itself, there was nothing special nearby aside from the dwarven pavement and the plain, blocky structures. He supposed that the entire town may have been built by the mountain dwarves, as legends claimed that their architecture was utilitarian and made exclusive use of stone. The glass ceiling above them was a distinctly human feature, however. Glass-covered market lanes and plazas that provided pedestrians and shop employees alike with pleasant outdoor conditions were becoming increasingly popular in our winter. He had never heard of an entire town being covered by glass, however, nor did he think that anyone could afford such an extravagance. Did the entire town stay green all winter? It would be quite the attraction if it did. Combined with the stone construction, the place gave off the feel of the frontier along the mountainous borderlands. Having the Azalizia Mountains stretching across the northern horizon lent far more weight to that notion than any painted landscape. A shift in the nearby footman's disposition alerted Rangobard to movement from one of the carriages across from them. The door swung open and a maid stepped out, followed by a young noblewoman with shoulder-length locks of light blonde hair. Her topaz eyes scanned the line of imperial carriages before fixing on Rangobard. A charming smile lit up her face and she came over to greet him. "Welcome to the Sorcerer's Kingdom." She spread out her pleated carnelian skirt in a graceful curtsy. "I am Countess Leanne Loretta Dale Wagner." Rangobotek wore Reburbad, he bowed deeply in return. "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Countess Wagner, Reburbad." Lady Wagner placed her index finger against the point of her chin as her eyes turned up in a thoughtful expression, as in the mage officer who acted as Baroness Sradnik's liaison. "The very same, my lady," Rangobard nodded. "I hope she hasn't shared any compromising tales about me at home." "The Baroness is not one for gossip," the Countess' smile returned. "Or much talk at all, for that matter. I would love for the opportunity to rectify the matter by personally getting to know you better." "Of course, Rangobard." Arlanda's voice came from behind him. "Who is this absolutely captivating young lady?" "Oh, sure, now you come out." After Rangobard introduced Arlanda to the Countess, his brother took over the conversation. That, in turn, didn't last long as their father appeared with several other nobles. Arlanda obligingly introduced the Countess to them, which took a good 15 minutes. "This town is quite the marvel, Countess Wagner," Count Reburbad said. "I don't recall its existence on any of our most recent maps." Zwillingstern was charted not long after the official establishment of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, Lord Reburbad. "Zwillingstern? Ah, you named it after the old towers straddling the highway. Now that you mention it, you do bear the features of the classical Eastern beauty." "You are most generous to say so, my lord," Lady Wagner nodded. "My family is indeed from the Imperial East, north of the Wagenmark. They settled here before." "Of course," Rangobard's father nodded in understanding. "Still, it is good to see strong Imperial stock here. Might I ask what our itinerary is now that we've arrived, my lady? It's nearly nightfall and the arrangements that we received didn't list our accommodations for this evening." Countess Wagner tilted her head curiously. "Is that so? It should have listed Corlin Castle as my lord's destination once your party arrived at the border." "Yes, that is correct." A hint of confusion put a slight tremor in Count Reburbad's voice. "If I'm not mistaken, however, Corlin Castle is just past Corlin Harbor, which is 2 or 3 days distant." Countess Wagner nodded, then lowered her head apologetically. "Forgive us for our presumption. The journey from our winter must have been long and tiring, so we thought to expedite your trip. The carriages you see before you will convey everyone the rest of the way." Count Reburbad exchanged a look with his allies. "Are they so large because they have beds in them?" one of the other counts asked. "I admit the quality of the road is quite extraordinary. I didn't feel a single bump between here and the border." "There are no beds, my lord," Lady Wagner replied. "One of the most notable benefits of our new infrastructure is that they allow vehicles designed for them to travel at great speeds with much heavier loads. We will arrive at Castle Corlin in less than 2 hours." "Less than 2 hours? Are these carriages some sort of magical device?" "They come with a number of enchantments. You will be able to travel with a sense of luxury rarely experienced outside of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Unless you end up like the Imperial House's party, of course." Everyone's expression sharpened at the last. The Imperial House? Count Roberbad said, we are aware that the dukes came ahead of us, but what happened? Lady Wagner shifted in place with a slightly scandalized look. They fled. Fled? Yes, my lord. They couldn't bear the terror you see around you and returned to our winter. Count Roberbad scanned the surroundings with a furrow on his brow. His cheek twitched once before he and the other nobles burst out into laughter. Fled? Shouldn't Gushmund have numbered amongst them? Didn't one of their daughters write that absurdly huge treatise about magocrats? Indeed, my lord, Lady Wagner said. In fact, she and one of her companions, who is also a mage, were the only ones able to tolerate the journey to its conclusion. The Countess pressed the tips of her fingers lightly together, gazing down at them with an uncertain look. Rangobart's father tugged on the lapels of his coat. Rest assured, Countess Wagner, he said. My party and I are made of sterner stuff than that. Oh, wonderful. The Countess beamed. In that case, how would my lords like to be organized? Each carriage can convey a dozen passengers, though I would personally recommend 6. We have enough vehicles that even your attendants may enjoy a ride inside. In that case. Each house took 2 carriages, one for its attendants, presumably to make last-minute preparations for their arrival. Rangobart's father, of course, insisted that Countess Wagner ride with them. A pleasant coolness washed over them when they entered the spacious cabin. This carriage has a temperature control item. Rangobart examined the lacquered wooden interior. That's right, Lady Wagner said. The temperature in here will remain consistent through every season. In addition to the temperature control, the interior was magically illuminated and no expense was spared for the furnishings. His family voiced their appreciation of what they saw and felt as they seated themselves around an oval table that had plenty of legroom beneath. This is very nearly a room in itself, Arlander said. Work around the fief would be extraordinarily comfortable with one of these carriages. There are plenty of features to enjoy. Countess Wagner flashed a brilliant smile as she gestured with a slender hand. For instance, the cupboards under the seats are all set to various temperatures and enchanted with preservation magic. You can store several days' worth of cold drinks and hot meals in them. The stowage overhead is perfect for storing office supplies and you can access the rear baggage by folding down the seats here. The door shut behind them. Count Roberbad ran his hands appreciatively over the polished surface of the cedar table. I'd rather work and sleep in here than stay overnight in a village chief's room, he said. What about these windows? I see that they're glass on the inside, but how do you open the shutters? Rangobart was pressed slightly into his seat as the carriage started to roll forward. There weren't horses or any other beasts hitched to them, so he wondered how they were moving. There's a panel flush with the door that you can open to access a hand crank, Lady Wagner said. Here? Rangobart's father leaned forward, feeling around with his hand. Closer to the center. I can't. Ah, how clever. This design is quite elegant. Rangobart watched, bemused, as his father transformed into any other man as he focused on figuring out the device. A few minutes later, he rolled down the metal shutters with a self-satisfied expression, revealing the pastoral landscape of Eranthal going by as the carriage hurtled down the highway. By the gods, Count Roberbad breathed, we are going as fast as you claimed. I can't feel the road under us at all. This vehicle may as well be floating on air. It's just one of the many innovations that the Sorceress Kingdom has to offer, my lord. Lady Wagner smiled. You'll surely be amazed at everything we've prepared for you. There was something else behind the young countess' smile, but Rangobart couldn't figure out what it was. At least his family's apprehension over their visit to the Sorceress Kingdom had vanished as if it had never existed in the first place.